Today I'm going to be brewing a Belgian Witbier, and I got the recipe from Radical Brewing, the one on page 207. This is possibly going to be the hardest beer I've brewed to date, so I'm a little bit excited and I'm not really sure what to expect, but we'll cover all that process. Basically, we're going to be doing an adjunct mash, but I'm also going to be pre-cooking the oatmeal, and then I'm going to have a separate mash, the main mash going on, so I'm kind of going to be handling 3 mashes at once. Other than that, I think it's possible to do it. So let me go ahead and just tell you about what I got here. And basically the recipe, I'm doing the full all grain mash. So I'm going to be using 6-row malt, and I'm going to be using that for the adjunct, basically the oatmeal and the wheat. Now the oatmeal I'm going to actually pre-cook before I add it to the wheat and the 6-row. So that's going to be basically one separate mash on its own. And then on the main mash, I'm just going to have, I got Belgian Pilsner malt and Munich malt. The Pilsner malt's 3 pounds, Munich malt is 1 pound. And then I got a pound of rice hulls, which is going to help me lauter. I'm not sure if I will need these or not, but I'm just going to add them. As far as hops, I went for the Tettnanger and Northern Brewer for their spiciness, earthy and kind of herbal or floral aromas. And then as far as spices, I went around the block here. There's a orange tree, and I just picked an orange out of there. I'm going to be using the zest out of that. I've got coriander seed. It's a little bit old, but it still has a lot of the aroma, so it should be good. It's maybe like a couple months old, but it should be good. And then I've got a tea bag of chamomile tea. So I'm just going to use the chamomile inside of this to add to the boil. So that's it for spices and herbs. For yeast, I picked up Belgian Wit, that's WLP 400, Belgian Wit ale yeast. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. So you want to start out by milling your grains, in this case your oatmeal, and you want to do this just a little bit at a time. That way you can actually mill it fine into a flour-like consistency. I started adding all the oatmeal into my pot, and then just continued to do that until I milled all of my oatmeal. I left that dry in there, and then I moved on to my wheat grains. Now your wheat grains are going to be a little bit hard to mill, but you basically want the same kind of like a flour-like consistency, so it's going to be really fine. That should help your extract efficiency. So you do this just a little bit at a time, and once you're done with that, you want to make sure you have all of your grains in your kettles before you even add any water, just to be prepared. That's a key thing when brewing a beer this hard. So I just took my 6-row grains, they're already milled, and I added that into my kettle with the wheat grains, and then I added my Pilsner malt and my Munich into my main mash tun. I also took care of any salt additions, so I did about 1/8 of a teaspoon of gypsum on my main mash and 1/4 of a teaspoon in my adjunct mash kettle. Once all that was taken care of, I started adding water to my oatmeal and began cooking that. Now while the oatmeal was cooking, I started also doughing in my adjunct mash. This one I did fairly thick. I stuck to about a quart per pound, maybe a little bit less, so it's fairly thick mash. And while I'm cooking the oatmeal, I brought that my adjunct mash to a temperature of about 104 degrees. The hard thing about this was keeping all the temperatures in check. Now if your oatmeal gets too gooey or thick, you can add a little bit more water, and then you're just going to basically cook it like regular oatmeal. And once that's done, you want to start adding all that oatmeal to your adjunct mash, make sure that you stir everything really well and that you don't overshoot your temperature. You want to bring it from 104 degrees to about 122 degrees to do a protein rest. You can do protein rest for about 15 minutes. So again, this whole time I'm also keeping track of my temperature on my water, which I'm going to use to strike the Pilsner and Munich malt in the main mash tun. Now while you're doing the protein rest, I also went ahead and added my strike water to the main mash, and I brought those grains to about 104 degrees. And I only got the grains like wet, so I didn't really use a whole lot of water to dough in. You want to make sure that you stir this constantly. You don't want the grains to stick to the bottom of the pot. And again, this is bringing the adjunct mash to a temperature of 150 degrees, and that's where we're going to do our starch to sugar conversion in the adjunct mash kettle. And once you get to that temperature, you want to do whatever you can to keep the temperature fairly constant, and you're going to leave that sitting there for about 15 minutes. Now it's a good time to check your pH on your adjunct mash. Now in my case I was a little bit high, so I went ahead and added another quarter teaspoon of gypsum to bring that down. And after that you just leave it sitting there. Make sure that you stir it constantly though, that way your grains don't stick to the bottom of the kettle. After you're done with your starch to sugar conversion, you want to bring this to a boil. And once you come to a boil, that's when you also want to go ahead and raise the temperature in your main mash to 122 degrees so you can do a protein rest with the Pilsner and Munich malts. Now as soon as you're done with that, you may want to go back to your adjunct mash kettle and just stir that constantly. That way your grains don't stick to the bottom of the kettle. In my case, some of my grains did stick and I got a little scorching, so I had to make sure that my mash wasn't too bad, and I'm going to be looking for some off flavors in my finished beer. But after that I just started taking the adjunct mash and adding it back to the main mash. Now you want to do this just a little bit at a time so that you don't overshoot your temperature. You want to bring your main mash from the protein rest of 122 degrees up to a temperature of 155 degrees. Now in my case, adding all of the adjunct mash to my main mash didn't bring my temperature up that high. I think I ended up at about 145 degrees, so I just ended up adding more hot water until I got to 155 degrees. And you can see at the end of my mash was fairly thin. I think I was at about a quart and a half, or actually closer to about 2 quarts per pound of grains. And since I use a lot of adjuncts on this beer, I had to do an iodine test. And the way to do it is you want to pour some iodophor into a white bowl. And if you add some of the mash liquid to the yellow portion of this, you want to thin out the iodophor in that plate. That's probably too much iodophor in the plate, but you want to use just enough so that you turn that yellow, you get that yellow tint on it. And you can see the starch, it turns that yellow color into a purple kind of mahogany color. Now when your mash is actually done, if you pour the mash liquid into that yellow portion, you can see that there's no color change. So then you can leave that sitting for a few minutes, and after a few minutes you can just pretty much see how that yellow color doesn't really change. And that's how you know that your mash is done. And this is what what an iodine test consists of. So once you confirm that, What I did, I started adding my rice hulls, and this is just going to help me lauter because there's a lot of adjuncts, a lot of the mash can get kind of sticky and thick, so the rice hulls will help me with that. And now I just started lautering. You can see how cloudy it looks. It's kind of like brownish looking, and all of that you want to recirculate it until the wort starts coming out fairly clear. I ended up pulling about a gallon on this one. You can see how the wort starts to clear out a little bit, and until you get to the point where it's pretty much clear. Now obviously this has a lot of wheat, and it's going to be a hazy beer, but you can see that the wort itself is actually pretty clear. And once you're done recirculating, you just start collecting your wort as usual and sparging. In my case, I just got a new pump, so I'm just pumping not boiling water but hot water to maintain my mash temperature fairly hot. You want to keep the lauter temperature about 160 degrees. And once you're done with that, then everything else is pretty standard. You start boiling your wort. You can expect a lot of foam with this kind of beer since you use wheat and oatmeal. It's got a lot of protein. And then once you start boiling, you start adding your first set of hops. You start the Northern Brewer at 90 minutes. And when you have 30 minutes left in the boil, you start adding your second set of hops. Now, in between the 30-minute and the 5-minute addition, you want to prepare your other ingredients. In this case, we're using the peel of the orange. You don't want to get the white pith of the orange. You just want the yellow, the outer peel. So just grind as much as you can off of that without getting any of the white stuff. And then the coriander, you want to actually crush that so that you can basically get to the inside. You don't want it too fine, but just enough to get into the inside of the coriander. So once you prepare all of that, you want to add your last set of hops when you have 5 minutes left in the boil, and at the same time you want to add all your spices, which is the chamomile, the coriander, and the orange zest. Now once you're done with that, about 5 minutes later, you want to send your wort into a whirlpool and start cooling it. Once you cool your wort, you want to aerate it. That's what the beer looks like after the boil. I use a strainer to aerate my wort, and then just pitch your yeast. Now this beer, I started fermenting at 66. Actually fermenting at 68, but since I cooled it a little bit too much, it was showing at 66. And then by the next morning, I started to see a little bit of airlock activity. So this was a really hard beer to brew. I actually enjoyed it a lot. So I hope you do too. Don't forget to like this video, share, and leave me a comment. I was pretty exhausted after this beer, so let me know what you think. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. We'll see you next time.
Just randomly combine caramel, malt, hops, and you're fine.
Let's do it.
All right, that's that.
We'll see. We're missing two.